This short video will cover some of the information that was discussed during a test question item writing professional development seminar presented by Dr. Eric Worth and Dr. Dana Schaefer at the University of Pikeville in September of 2017. The audience for this presentation was experienced faculty, primarily those who have experience writing exams, in particular multiple choice questions, and would like to improve those test questions and make them more challenging. The audience for this presentation was experienced faculty, primarily those who are in charge or have a responsibility of writing test questions, primarily multiple choice test questions, and they want those test questions to be as effective as possible and perhaps even make them more challenging. The objectives for this session are to be able to distinguish the types of questions that you might run into or that you may write based on Bloom's taxonomy and discuss why that's important. Get feedback on writing a realistic stem and plausible distractors for multiple choice test questions, and then discuss a little bit about the cues that students may use to answer a question without fully understanding the material and how we can eliminate as many of those from our tests as possible. The objectives for the presentation and this video are to be able to distinguish between types of questions based on Bloom's taxonomy, to get some feedback and some information in this clip on writing realistic stems and plausible distractors for questions, and then be able to discuss what are some of the clues that students who are savvy use in answering test questions if perhaps they don't know the answer, and how we can help eliminate those so that we have as great a confidence as we can that when a student answers a question correctly, it's because they actually mastered the material that we intended them to. So to that end, the objectives of this session are to distinguish the types of a question based on Bloom's taxonomy and why that's important, to discuss and get feedback on realistic test stems and plausible distractors, and then to look at the clues that some students use to answer questions when perhaps they aren't familiar with the material enough to answer it directly. The intent being that if a student answers a question, we want to have pretty high confidence that if they got the right answer, it's because they really mastered the material that was intended and not that they were using clues in the question itself or within the test to be able to answer that test question. So before looking at specific hints on writing test questions, we're going to go over Bloom's taxonomy, which is more of kind of a strategy for writing test questions. You can use it to develop curriculum and align curriculum as well. But since this is on test questions, we're going to speak about it specifically from that perspective. So back in the 1950s or so, an educational researcher by the name of Benjamin Bloom looked at how we learn and broke that down into really 3 different domains of learning. One of them being psychomotor, dealing with how it is that we actually physically do things and physical skills. The affective domain, dealing with feelings. And the cognitive domain, dealing with those more concrete learning items and what we would associate normally with learning within a classroom. He further broke down the cognitive domain into 6 different categories, from the lowest level thinking skills that take the least amount of skill to answer a question or to learn, all the way up to the very highest level and most complex level of learning. And those words were changed a little bit over time, but we see them here in this revised Bloom's taxonomy chart, where we have at the very bottom remembering, dealing with just basic recall of information, then up from there to understanding, making sense of what you've learned, applying, using the knowledge gained in a new way, analyzing, breaking a concept into parts and understanding how the part is related to one another, evaluating, which is making judgments based on a set of guidelines, and then creating, which is putting information together in an innovative way. So basically the idea is and as we're using it for test questions, you can have very low levels of learning down at remembering, where all you're doing is essentially memorizing and regurgitating information, all the way up to the most complex levels of learning. And generally, this arrow over here is indicating that as you go up, both the complexity of thought goes up and the amount of information you have to pull together from multiple sources goes up. The first three levels are often referred to as lower order thinking skills, or lots, whereas the upper levels are referred to often as higher order thinking skills, or HOTS. And when we're talking about test questions, it doesn't mean that any one of these is necessarily better than another. It's just an awareness factor. And why it's important is that remembering questions, they're normally very easy to write. The remembering and understanding areas, because they're easy to write, we often write a lot of test questions covering those areas. The higher level ones, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, it can be difficult to write a multiple choice question for those, although not impossible. It takes more time to do, and because of that, very frequently, if we look at an entire test, we may have a large portion of our questions back down in the lower order thinking skills and fewer in the higher order thinking skills. And where that can become problematic is the purpose of the exam. If the purpose of the exam is to test some of the higher level thinking skills, but most of the test is lower order thinking skill questions, then we have a disconnect between what we're trying to accomplish and what we're actually doing. This can be exacerbated in a situation where the test is designed to prepare students for some national exam, board exams, those type of things. If there's a disconnect between the types of questions we're asking them early on or during their early years of schooling or training, and later on when they actually get to these high stakes exams, we may have created for them an easy way to fail by not preparing them for the level of question they're likely to encounter. So it's important to look at these for that perspective, and also from a very practical standpoint. If we're developing a test, the lower order thinking skills questions are normally very quick to answer, so you can answer many of them in a short period of time. The higher order thinking skills often take quite a bit more time to answer the question. So we need to look at the balance between how we put those together on a test to make sure that we don't have too many lower order thinking skills and students finish too quickly, or too many higher order thinking skill questions and the students don't have time to answer those and as a result do poorly on the test. When looking at this, you can take a look at breaking down individual questions by these 6 levels, but often what I do is just break it down to the questions that cover the two lower levels, remembering or understanding, and those that go further than that. So breaking it down to the lowest levels or a higher level question, and normally that's where I see the most issue, is people writing a lot of questions and remembering and understanding and not really hitting some of the other questions up this direction. So there are verb cues that we can look at when we're looking at a test question or writing a test question and trying to figure out where might this fit on Bloom's taxonomy. So we have in here recall facts and basic concepts in the remember area, and define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, state. Those are all cues that are either in an objective or in a test question that might lead us to believe that that's remembering. Understanding, oftentimes we'll see classify, describe, discuss, explain, identify, some of the other ones there. Apply, implement, solve, use, demonstrate, interpret, sketch, schedule, analyze, maybe differentiate, organize, relate, compare, contrast, distinguish, evaluate, argue, defend, judge, select, support, value, critique, and create, often design, assemble, construct, develop, formulate. And these aren't necessarily just a rule, that when you see a word like this is certainly in one of these areas. It could differ depending on how it's written. And again, what you see from this is that when you're in the very higher levels of thinking, it's probably easier to reach the students and be able to determine whether they've mastered something in a way other than a multiple choice test question. Maybe it's an essay question, short answer, or perhaps it's more of a practical exercise or a presentation. But it is possible to get to those higher levels of thinking skills, even up to create with well-worded test questions in the multiple choice area. However, they take a little while to write, and may take a little while to answer on the student's part. So here's a couple exam questions, and we're not going to look very specifically at what level these are and spend the time to do that, but we do want to look at this from the perspective of, are these higher order or lower order thinking skills? And if we look at these questions, how would a student's thought process and the thinking level they need to be at differ because of these? So if we take a look at this first one here, it says, which of the following are gram-negative bacteria? Select all that apply. So here we have a list of A, B, C, D, and E for all the different bacteria that are selected here. It does say select all that apply, so this would suggest that you could pick one of these or all of them. However, really what the student just needs to be able to do is have memorized different types of bacteria and whether they're gram-negative or positive. So this would be at that very lowest level, just a remembering or memorization type of question. The next one, if we go down to the second question, says, which of the following bacteria are likely to be effectively treated with cephalexin? And again, we have a list of 5 different bacteria. In this case, you not only have to know as a student what the bacteria are and some about their characteristics, you need to know what cephalexin is, and you need to know what its mode of bactericidal operation is. How does it kill or inhibit the growth of bacteria? You have to know then, based on how it functions as an antibiotic, what kind of bacteria are likely to be affected by it. So you see, you have to put multiple pieces of information together to answer this one question, as opposed to just memorizing a simple fact. Now, if we go to the third one, it says, FD was generally healthy until his impacted wisdom tooth was removed by an oral surgeon. The area where the tooth had been was sore, but what was more alarming was the appearance of eruptions through the skin beneath the area of the jaw where the tooth had been. The exudate draining through the skin eruptions was cultured aerobically, but the results were negative. Which of the following is the most probable etiologic agent of the patient's condition? And again, there are multiple choices here. So again, in this case now, a student has to go through, not only are they just memorizing material, but they have to be able to go through, read a situation, make a judgment based on how those pieces of data fit together, and then based on that information, look at the different potential agents that could cause that condition and pick the most reasonable one. So we're looking at a much higher level thinking skill. But if we look at this, we can tell which one's going to take the longest to answer, and we can also tell which one's going to take the longest to write. So that's where it comes down to understanding, when we're putting material together, what are we doing and how are we doing it in relation to something like Bloom's taxonomy. And then when we're looking at this type of learning, be able to assess what it is that we're trying to have students accomplish. Because if our goal is to reach the higher levels, like this last question, and that's the kind of learning we want the students to have demonstrated, then we need to have some of those questions on there to be able to find out whether or not students have answered those correctly. Before we go on to some actual hints, I want to take a look at the actual structure of the question so we know the terminology that's coming up. This part of the question, where you have the actual question itself, is called the stem of the question. And the questions down below, you'll have one correct answer or multiple correct answers, and then you'll have the distractors. So those are the choices, but then you'll have the correct answers, and the distractors are the ones that are not correct in that list. When we talk about questions, we will talk about how it is that we can construct these so that it helps accomplish our goal. So for example, select all that apply here. This suggests that a student could answer A, B, C, D, E, any of them. It's not all the above or none of the above. It is not select the two of the following. Now, if you're going to be aligning your test to what it is that the students have to do later on, if they have a board exam or a national exam later on that either uses specific types of questions or says that there aren't specific types of questions on the exam, then that can inform how you write quite a bit. If the exam that you're trying to prepare students for in the future does not use all of the above or none of the above, it wouldn't make any sense to write those in questions that the students have earlier on. The same thing goes for select all that apply. I like that because it doesn't give cues to the students on how many of the answers are likely to be correct. But at the same point, if the exam they're going to be taking in the future, the highest stake exam, does actually give them those types of cues, select two of the following or whatever it says, then matching that makes more sense than not, because again, you're not only determining whether students are mastered the material that's on that test, but you have also now gone back and helped prepare them for the level of question and the type of question they're going to experience later on, which should make them more comfortable and more successful when they come to those tests. So as far as basic tips on question construction, you should have a clear objective for each question, and that objective should be high frequency and or high impact. And the idea here is just that you're not writing a lot of test questions on very minute details that really aren't important to later on. They're not the big picture items. The most important objectives that you have should be represented as such within tests. It doesn't mean that some of the other questions aren't important, it's just they shouldn't constitute the majority of the questions you're writing. The idea isn't to pick out these strange facts and test students on those as much as to determine whether or not they've learned the big concepts, the most important things that you are teaching. In some ways you might be able to look at it as layers, where you have one layer of the material that the students absolutely had to know, that was the critical knowledge. Then you have maybe a layer of things that are important for students to know, and then another layer of items that are good for the students to know but not maybe critical. Well, the majority of the test questions should come from those critical areas and those really important to know areas, and it shouldn't be overrepresented by this space that is just good to know but not really important. And mapping questions to objectives, the way you might map your content to the objectives, is very important too, because if you're asking a question about something, it would suggest that that's important enough to be able to ask a question on it. And if it's important enough for that, then it's good to know what objective it is and be able to determine later on if students have been able to master those objectives and help the students that haven't. The STEM should be clear and concise, but with specific information to answer the question. So on the previous slide, we saw an example of a relatively long question. All the material that was in there was important to answering the question. There wasn't anything that was material just to throw students off or material that was not needed in the particular question. All the material was needed for the answer to the question. It was concise as it could be, but it gave them the information that was important in making the determination that they needed to for the question. You should not be able to answer the question lead, the actual what is the question that you're trying to answer, that's the lead, without using the entire stem of the information. So you shouldn't be able to go to the very last sentence of a question, read that last sentence and answer the question without any of the material that came before. Answer options should all be plausible, homogeneous in length, type, and degree of specificity. So we don't put in test questions with distractors that are clearly not right, because students will just go and cross those off. There's really no point of asking it. All the distractors should be plausible. There should be clearly the right answers are right and the wrong answers are wrong, but all of them should be plausible. Homogeneous in length means you don't make the right answer longer than the others, and this is very commonly done. When I teach students how to answer test questions, I always say that if they don't know the answer, pick the longest response, because if somebody took the time to write a longer response, there's a good chance that it might be the correct answer. So you want to make sure the lengths are all about the same. Type and degree of specificity. So again, this comes into length very often, but all the answers should look similar in those ways so that a student can't get clues on how to answer it by just looking at the question itself. We don't want to give clues based on grammatical elements. So, a good student will be able to go through and look in the question stem, and if it's plural, be able to look for answers that are plural and know that it has to be one of those. So, the A with a parentheses and. So it's a or an is a good way of getting around this to some degree, because this takes away the idea that I could know basically how the answer should start based on what grammatical rules are. And singular plural goes the same way. So you want to make sure that the questions are written such that students can't answer them based on just what grammatically makes sense. Do not use all of the above or none of the above. And there's a couple reasons this might be done. If it's not done, those questions aren't used on future exams the students will take, there's no sense in putting them in earlier. But also all the above and none of the above, while they can be done okay and they can be done well, generally they're easier questions to answer, because if I can find two of the responses that are correct and all the above is an option, it's probably all the above. Unless one of the other questions says something like A and B are correct, or only A and C are correct. In those cases, then it gets away from all the above or none of the above, giving the clue to what the answer is by just looking at a couple of the other responses. But generally what happens is I might have 3 or 4 responses, students pick out the first 2, and so they know that it has to be all the above. And then do not allow one question on a test to answer another. This can be difficult depending on how you build your tests. If they're randomized, you might not know what questions are coming up, but you really don't want one question on an exam being able to answer the others. So a very common way this might be done is if I were asking like a question earlier about gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and then later on in the test, I list out in a question gram-negative bacteria, a student can go back and then cross-reference those questions and be able to answer one of their other questions on the test question, maybe question 4, by looking at question 12. And we don't want that to be the case. We want to make sure that students, if they answer the question correctly, they know the material. If they don't know the material, they don't have a very high opportunity to get it right. Here are some well-known foundational flaws. Controversial or subjects that are likely to change. So this is different depending on what field they are, but think of a situation in which there's a particular recommendation and maybe multiple organizations have different recommendations, or the recommendations for certain things, maybe it's an immunization schedule, for example. You ask a question like that and maybe the next year those suggestions change. If that's the case, you need to go back to those test questions and make sure that you aren't asking material of students that was accurate at the time the question was written, but is no longer accurate. So you want to make sure that, as much as possible, ask questions where the material is not likely to be changed, or if it's controversial, then you might run into a situation, again, where as that controversy or those discussions move forward, the question no longer applies because it really dealt with the situation at a particular time that has now passed. We don't want insufficiently challenging questions. if over 90% of the students, for example, get an answer correct, it's not doing a good job of discriminating the students who are knowledgeable of the material and those that are not. So if everybody gets a question right, for example, it doesn't do any job discriminating who are the high achieving students, the A's, B's from the C's, D's, those types of things. So you want questions, and you look at a question to be able to do a good job of discriminating students who know the material from those who don't. You can look at different measures for that. For example, you can look at a discrimination index where it looks at, well, how does a student who answers this question correct, do they answer other questions correct generally? You would hope that a student who does well on one question generally does well on other questions that are either similar to that one, or you hope that the student does well on the test, also does well on that kind of question. So again, what you're hoping for is to be able to get some stratification in your student scores because of those questions. And if this question is not doing that, it's not a good question. Zebras. You want to ask things dealing with a high frequency or high impact. You don't want to focus too much on these odd situations that may exist at some point but aren't the common things. So there's no point necessarily of writing test questions where really what you're asking is mostly those situations that people never run into, or you're testing them on facts that aren't really that important to know. And in doing so, not testing them on things that are the bigger picture items. We talked about this already, basic recall of isolated facts. We don't want to just do that. We don't want that lower level thinking to be the extent of what we're testing students on. Questions should be referenceable. So students who come back and have an issue with test questions and want to challenge those, it normally comes down to their belief that the right answer isn't correct, that there are multiple answers that are correct, or that one of the other choices that was marked as wrong is actually better than the one that was marked as right, or that the material wasn't covered. So it's important to be able to go back to material and say, if we're testing on this material, here's where students would be able to get that. And it could be in lecture, it could be in notes, material that was provided to the students, textbooks, those kind of things. But we should be able to point back and say the students have the opportunity to learn this material from this place. And that way, if a student comes forward and says that it was not a fair question because it wasn't provided, that information wasn't given to them, you can point clearly back to where that was covered and show the students where it is that they should have looked to be able to learn that material. And finally, avoid teaching in the STEM. That STEM part of the question where you're asking the question itself, that's not a place to teach material. So you don't want that to turn into a paragraph where you're teaching students something within the STEM. You really want that to be the information that's needed to answer the question, not an opportunity to teach the students something else. So those are some basic hints of writing test questions. Certainly there's a lot of others that can be done. If you were in the professional development session, we would have taken time to write down kind of some objectives for our areas, write a test question that's effective for those, looking at the level of thinking, particularly higher order or lower order thinking skills, and then get feedback from others. If you're watching this video and you weren't at the presentation, you can certainly do this with colleagues of your own. You can give the test questions that you write to somebody who's not familiar with the material. If they can answer the questions and do well on a question, maybe the question isn't written very well. If somebody without information and knowledge of that material can answer the question, there's probably some problem with the question. Second, somebody that is familiar with the material can give you really good feedback on how the questions are written and whether or not you're covering the breadth and the width of that topic. So somebody can look over those questions and tell you that perhaps you have some test question items, some of those distractors that are really too close to being correct, or maybe they read the question differently than you intended it to be written, and so we're answering it in the right way. Having colleagues look at your questions, whether they do or do not know the material, can be valuable in both regards. So I encourage you to go back, If you're analyzing your own test questions, look at them in relation to the hints and the ideas that we're given here. Look at what level those questions are on. And if you're writing test questions, look at what you're trying to accomplish with those test questions and make sure those align with what you're actually putting on the test or potentially giving students to be on that test. And then from there, I highly suggest you give them to some colleagues and have them look at what it is that you wrote and provide you feedback, because multiple eyes looking on things will really help you to be able to sharpen your test writing ability. So we hope that you, coming through this presentation, have learned some really good skills that you can use and go put those into practice. If you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to either one of us, but hopefully this will put you on a track where over time you can implement these things. Maybe at first it's kind of difficult to think about and takes a little bit more time, but I'm confident that as you continue to write test questions and you put these things in place, you'll have better results, and in the end you'll find yourself being able to write really effective test questions much quicker.